It's a strange thing, isn't it? How casually we accept that the living occupy time like tenants in a rented house, while the dead, so we assume, take their leave and vanish into some distant elsewhere. Yet history keeps leaving thin fingerprints on the mind that suggest a very different arrangement. People report encounters that feel less like intrusions from another world and more like collisions with something that never left this one. Others sense presences that don't behave as if they're hovering above us or watching from afar, but instead are moving in a world aligned with ours in ways we don't yet have the language to map. So the question becomes less, are the dead here? And more, where exactly are they walking? To understand this, we must first unravel the quiet assumption that time is a river and we're all swept along in it. It's a poetic idea, but when physicists peer closely, they don't see a river at all. They see something closer to a vast landscape frozen into existence all at once. In that picture, each moment isn't a place on a timeline, but a location with its own coordinates. The past, by that framework, doesn't disappear. It persists like a valley behind a mountain ridge, out of sight but still existing in full. What you call yesterday is still somewhere, the way a childhood bedroom still exists even after you've grown and moved out, the paint on the walls quietly aging in your absence. If reality truly works this way, then the question becomes profoundly practical. Who or what else can move through that landscape besides us? Most people describe the dead as if they float like lanterns above the flow of time, peering down. But what if the dead are not above anything? What if they wander laterally, through memories made physical, through moments still warm with the momentum of experience? Some researchers into anomalous experiences have quietly wondered whether so-called hauntings could be less about spirits stuck in the past and more about the past itself remaining fully present, waiting for something, someone, to brush against it. This raises a deeply unsettling thought. Perhaps the dead aren't haunting us. Perhaps they're merely walking through a place they still recognize. Perhaps they turn a corner in whatever world they inhabit, and the curtain between now and then ripples open for an instant, and both sides see something that isn't supposed to be there. Think of two rooms sharing a thin, warping wall. Sound doesn't mean to leak across, and yet it does. You hear a laugh you can't trace. A shadow crosses the edge of your vision with its own steady rhythm. A coldness moves through a warm room like a traveller that has taken a wrong hallway. But let's step into this carefully. Imagine time not as a line, not as a river, but as a layered space, each moment stacked like translucent pages. You stand on one page, convinced it's the only place ink can be written. But just beneath your feet lies another page, still inked with the footprint of someone who lived 100 years ago. And below that, one bearing a person who lived 1,000 years ago. And despite the separation, sometimes the ink from older pages bleeds through. Sometimes your own presence presses faintly through the veneer and touches something beneath. If those deeper pages hold the dead, then perhaps the dead are not drifting through your world at all. Perhaps you are brushing against theirs. But this leads to something even stranger. If existence is layered, then what moves between the layers? What has the flexibility to slip not just from moment to moment, but from one temporal layer to another? Some traditions suggest consciousness itself isn't tethered to a single plane, the same way the body is. Consciousness may be the true traveller, the wanderer, the part of you that could, in theory, move while everything else remains pinned in place. And if consciousness is what survives death, if identity, awareness, will, and memory continue, then perhaps the dead have simply learned to move through these layers with ease. They aren't bound to the page of time where they once lived, the way you aren't bound to the house where you were born. They can leave their moment, return to it, revisit crossroads, revisit choices, revisit the people they loved, even if those people now live decades later. And one might say that the dead could be strolling through memories that have become topography. The moment of a last conversation might exist as a kind of room they can step back into. The day they first realized something important might be a place they can pause and reflect in. The moment they lost someone might be a corridor they walked through carefully, and what the living call a ghost moment might be the instant when one of those journeys brushes against the terrain of the present. This view doesn't require anything supernatural. It only requires accepting the possibility that what we call time is an artifact of how human minds process change, not a boundary the universe actually respects. Deep inside our cells, every atom arrives here carrying a history billions of years long. Hydrogen born in ancient stars still vibrates inside your blood. Carbon forged in cosmic furnaces still structures your bones. If matter can carry the past into the present without difficulty, why not consciousness? Many people who have had near-death experiences report that the moment they left their bodies, time lost all the usual edges. Seconds behaved like rooms they could walk around in. Memories opened like windows, and events that happened decades apart felt side by side, like scenes in an unfinished painting. None of them described time as disappearing. They describe being able to move through it differently. They describe perspective, not annihilation. If consciousness can move this way when the body is failing, why not after it has been shed entirely? Which brings us to an unsettling, fascinating possibility. Maybe the dead are not watching us from some distance. Maybe they are simply nearby in a neighborhood of time the living rarely visit. Perhaps what you call the present is only a narrow hallway, and the dead wander rooms you can sense only faintly, like perfumed air drifting under a doorframe. They may be passing through their own familiar seasons, but the walls between those seasons and your daily life are thin. Now and then, when someone thinks of a loved one with enough clarity that it sharpens the moment like a lens, those walls ripple. The boundary softens. A whisper seems to come from nowhere. A presence feels absolutely real. A coincidence occurs with such precision that you're forced to wonder whether someone placed it there like a small stone to catch your attention. Consider the countless reports of people dreaming of deceased relatives who appear not as phantoms but as themselves, fully present, coherent, conveying information beyond the dreamer's knowledge. These encounters aren't chaotic or symbolic, they behave like meetings, and meetings imply location. They imply two travelers arriving at the same intersection, however briefly. If the dead can approach through memory, then memory may not be a function of the brain alone. It may be a landscape shared by minds that no longer need bodies. There is also a growing idea in theoretical research that consciousness might function like a pattern imprinted on the fabric of space-time itself. When the body ends, the pattern doesn't necessarily vanish. It merely stops being generated by biological machinery. But if the pattern remains, it may maintain a kind of movement or presence in the places it once occupied. Not every movement is locomotion. Some movements are alignment, shifts of resonance, proximity of patterns that hum near each other like chords held in the air. Imagine standing in a quiet room and humming a note. Now imagine someone else humming the same note from behind a thin curtain. You can't see them, but you feel the air adjust. Your own voice changes because of theirs. Waves overlap. Patterns interfere. Something happens that neither voice can accomplish alone. This is perhaps how the presence of the dead touches the living. Not through footsteps, not through eyes watching you, but through the meeting of patterns across layers of time. This perspective also sheds light on why some places feel alive with history. A battlefield thick with unresolved intention. A childhood home steeped in laughter and arguments. A hospital corridor heavy with exits and entries. All these are steeped in patterned consciousness. If the dead occupy their own layers, these locations may be intersections where the walls between layers are thinner. People often sense something in such places not because spirits linger like lost travelers, but because these spaces resonate with multiple time layers at once, like chords vibrating through a wooden floor. But not every encounter is familiar or comforting. Some experiences feel foreign, cold, or dissonant, as if someone brushing against your moment does not recognize you at all. Many so-called hauntings involve presences that behave as though they're simply moving through their own environment, unaware of the living inhabitants. Doors close with no intention of communication. Footsteps echo with the same steady pattern each night. Objects fall as though someone moved them on the other side of a thin glass. These aren't acts of malice. They may be echoes of people navigating a space that doesn't map neatly onto ours. They might be turning a corner that in their world leads someplace else entirely, while in ours it cuts through your quiet living room. Their world might be an older page layered under yours, still holding the shapes of furniture long gone, walls repainted 3 times since, and paths that would confuse anyone if they could see both layers at once. If the dead truly move through something that includes the past, they might not perceive the present the way you do. They might walk through rooms that once existed, unaware that time has replaced those rooms with new shapes. Perhaps they hear muffled voices the way you hear sounds in the distance, a mixture of familiarity and distortion. Perhaps they see flickers of movement they can't place, not knowing those flickers are the living. Perhaps they believe we are the ghosts. This isn't merely poetic speculation. Consider that the human brain constructs the present out of fragments arriving at slightly different times. Light from the eyes, vibration from the ears, tactile signals from the skin. The brain blends them to create now, but the process introduces delays and smoothing. Your present is already partly memory. That means even the living experience reality through layered moments. If consciousness after death is no longer anchored to a nervous system, it may perceive time with far more freedom or far less stability. The dead may experience all their moments as accessible, the way you can walk through a gallery of paintings. But occasionally they may lean too close to the canvas of the living and leave a smudge of presence you can feel. All this brings us to an even more radical thought. Maybe the dead inhabit something that is neither past nor present. Maybe the categories themselves are inadequate. The human mind, in its drive to carve reality into digestible slices, labelled one slice before, one slice now, and one slice after. But these labels may be like naming the colours of a spectrum that never intended to be divided. The dead might be moving in a place where moments blur, where choices unfold sideways, where memories are rooms, and where the living appear only as thin flickers on a distant horizon. If we follow the trail of this idea, that the dead navigate a layered reality where moments persist like rooms, then we can start to look more closely at the mechanics of such movement. Not in the sense of tracking footsteps, but in the way astronomers infer the positions of unseen planets by the wobble they create in starlight. We infer the presence of the dead by the distortions, impressions, and ripples they leave in the fabric we call ordinary life. One of the most striking things among people who claim encounters with the departed is how rarely these encounters behave, like conversations with someone simply floating nearby. Instead, they behave like intrusions from a world just out of alignment. People describe seeing their loved one not as a ghostly blur, but as if they were stepping into view from a place that overlaps their own. A figure suddenly present at the foot of the bed, clear as daylight yet fragile, like they're made of mist that hasn't decided whether to condense. Then the figure is gone, as if their world shifted a few degrees and the overlap dissolved. These scenes don't feel random to the witnesses, they feel purposeful, like windows opening against expectation, and windows imply architecture. Something structural, something designed by the way consciousness interacts with time. To explore that architecture, imagine that the universe is not a sequence of moments, but a landscape of them, each one persistent, occupied, and real. In that case, what you call the past may be less like a memory and more like a country with borders you rarely cross. The dead, no longer tethered to the chronology that keeps you in one narrow sliver, may be able to cross those borders freely. They might visit the moment they first learned your name, rest for a while in a moment where they felt profound joy, or step lightly through a moment of regret, revisiting it not to change it but to understand it with more depth than they ever had in life. But this kind of travel isn't purely sentimental. Those who have had near-death experiences say that once they left their bodies, events from their lives unfolded not linearly but spatially. Moments stretched out like rooms arranged in a spiral around them. They described being able to enter one room and feel the emotional weight of a decision, then step into another and see the consequences ripple outward like patterns in sand. If this kind of perception becomes normal after death, then movement between moments wouldn't be unusual at all. It would be as natural as turning your head from left to right. This suggests that the living and the dead may sometimes share the same coordinates, just not the same moment. You might be sitting in your kitchen drinking tea, while in another layer of the same space, someone who died 50 years ago is standing in what was, for them, the same kitchen, but with different wallpaper, different furniture, different sounds drifting through an open window. If both of you happen to shift slightly, if your consciousness loosens in a daydream, or if theirs sharpens in memory, the layers might briefly align, and in that narrow overlap, each becomes aware of the other. That alignment could explain those uncanny moments when people sense someone standing very close, even though they're alone. Not a vague fear, but a precise awareness, as if a human presence is occupying the space just behind their shoulder. Sometimes the feeling is warm, almost familiar. Other times it's utterly foreign. The foreign ones may be people from other layers whose lives had nothing to do with yours, an unknown neighbour from a century ago, a wanderer who once passed through your land long before your home existed. They notice something, a shift in air, a flicker, and perhaps they turn their head. You feel the echo of their gaze without ever seeing them. Of course, many resist this framework because it challenges the notion that time progresses cleanly. But clean progress is a fiction the living invented to make experience digestible. The dead, if they've shed the machinery that enforces linear perception, may see reality with its full complexity. They might drift through moments like someone walking along stepping stones across a pond. Not every stone in order, but whichever one offers the clarity they seek. This raises another possibility. Perhaps some so-called hauntings are not hauntings at all. Perhaps they are the dead simply following their familiar paths across their own layer of time, unaware that those paths intersect your world. Footsteps in the hallway that occur every night at the same hour may not be ritualistic behavior from a spirit, but the echo of someone walking through their own Tuesday evening, unaware that the building has changed. The dead may walk through walls because the walls they remember no longer exist. Or they may appear to glide across the floor because in their world, they are stepping across a threshold that has long since been remodeled. This also explains why objects sometimes move or vanish in ways that defy neat explanations. Imagine someone in another layer reaching out to grab something that, in their reality, still sits on a table. They see it clearly: a book, a cup, a small trinket they once cherished. But in your world, the table is empty. Yet when they reach, the layers touch, and the object in your layer shifts lightly, like a shadow being nudged. You interpret it as a sign. They interpret it as a memory they can almost reclaim but not quite grasp. There's another angle to this that deserves attention. Many cultures describe ancestors as present not through vision, but through influence. They whisper as intuition. They linger in dreams. They guide through sudden clarity. These aren't metaphors for grief. They may be descriptions of how consciousness behaves when freed from the constraints of a single moment. If the dead can step into your thoughts the way they step into memories, then communication may not require words at all. It might occur through resonance, patterns aligning briefly across layers. Think of how sometimes you think of someone intensely, only to discover they were thinking of you at the same moment, or how you feel a sudden, inexplicable comfort in the middle of sorrow, as if wrapped by a presence that feels familiar without needing to appear. If consciousness has a landscape of its own, then these experiences might be moments when two presences draw close in that landscape. The dead may approach gently, not as observers, but as participants still connected to the people they care about. This view also sheds light on why dreams often feel more real than waking life. In dreams, the mind loosens its grip on linear time. It wanders, it drifts, It crosses boundaries more easily. In that state, the living might unintentionally enter the layers where the dead dwell. Not fully, but enough for a meeting, enough for a conversation that feels like it has weight, meaning, intention, enough for the dreamer to wake with the sense that something independent entered the dream, something with its own will. In such meetings, the dead may appear younger, healthier, clearer, as if they are returning from the version of themselves that existed at their peak, not at their final days. They might offer advice or comfort or simply presence. What makes these dreams notable is how often they contain information or emotional insights the dreamer didn't previously hold. It is as if the dead are not conjured from memory, but encountered in a shared, malleable terrain, where both sides can meet on equal footing. What's fascinating is how consistently people report that these dream encounters feel nothing like ordinary dreams. Ordinary dreams dissolve in the morning light. These encounters remain vivid for years, sharp, coherent, emotionally precise. They feel like someone stepping through a doorway, talking with you for a moment, and then stepping back out. The implications of this are enormous. If the dead can reach through dreams, intuition, memory, and rare moments of alignment, then the landscape they traverse might be far more accessible than the living assume. Not a heavenly kingdom perched in the sky, not a distant realm separated by cosmic distance, but a world woven into the folds of this one, a world only slightly out of focus. If so, then the dead may be learning how to move through layers more easily, learning how to visit certain moments more deliberately, learning which memories to approach and which to leave untouched. Perhaps every individual, upon shedding the body, must first find their bearings. They must explore their own timeline, learn its patterns, understand the emotional terrain they once walked blindly. And as they do, they become better at navigating the boundary between layers. Some may grow skilled at approaching the living, sensing when someone they loved is open, when their grief or longing or curiosity has thinned the walls. Others may avoid approaching entirely, preferring to remain within their own layers, exploring the echoes of their lives. And still others may be so confused by their newfound freedom that they wander aimlessly, appearing only in flashes, like sparks seen in the periphery of vision. It's often said that children are more sensitive to presences than adults, but perhaps children simply haven't yet anchored themselves to a rigid perception of time. Their sense of the present is wide, stretchy, porous. They do not insist that only one moment exists. They drift freely through imagination, possibility, and memory. The walls between layers are thinner for them because they have not yet learned to enforce them. This would explain why many children report seeing figures or sensing presences with a clarity that adults dismiss. As they grow older, their perception tightens, the boundaries sharpen, and the layers separate. The presences fade not because the dead withdraw, but because the living lose the ability to perceive the overlap. Interestingly, some people regain this ability later in life. As the mind begins to soften around the edges, through age, illness, or profound experiences, the boundaries loosen once more. Elderly people often speak to deceased loved ones shortly before they pass. Some describe seeing them in the room, standing patiently, waiting. Others speak as if conversing across the boundary without any confusion. These aren't hallucinations in the clinical sense. They may be glimpses of the layered reality becoming clear again, the mind easing back into the broader landscape of time it inhabited before birth. If so, then consciousness might be inherently unbounded, only temporarily restricted by the nervous system. When the nervous system fades, the perception expands again. The dead may not be bound to any chronological order, because consciousness never was. The mind simply adapts to the constraints of the body while it is alive. When those constraints lift, it returns to its natural state, which may involve perceiving multiple moments at once. But perception is not the same as location. The dead may perceive many moments, but where do they primarily exist? Do they inhabit some central moment of their choosing, or do they hover between possibilities like travelers in a busy station? The living often imagine the dead as appearing exactly as they were in their final days, but reports consistently contradict this. People don't see the frail or the sick. They see the vibrant. They see the version of the person who felt most themselves. This suggests that the dead may anchor themselves in what we might call a core identity, a moment when they felt whole, balanced, aligned. From that anchor point, they can roam. Some might choose to anchor at a joyful moment. Others might anchor at a moment of significance or understanding. Still others might drift between anchors, exploring their lives with the clarity of hindsight. And occasionally, when they approach the living, they present themselves as the version they most cherished. The question now becomes, when the dead step into our world, do they see us clearly? Or do they see only fragments, shimmers, intentions, emotional echoes? If their perception spans multiple layers, your presence might appear to them like a moving halo. Your thoughts faint patterns, your emotions bright colours. They may not see your face as you do. They may perceive your essence instead. That's why encounters with the dead often feel intimate even when no words are exchanged. The dead may perceive the living in a more complete way than the living perceive themselves. If the living occupy a moving present and the future waits like a distant shore, then where do those who have slipped out of time actually stand? Some traditions insist they remain tethered close, hovering just a fraction outside our senses. Others claim they drift into vast halls of memory, where moments never decay and every second of their former lives remains suspended like insects in amber. But if either of these ideas is true, then we have to face something stranger. The boundaries we assume between past, present, and whatever lies beyond may not be boundaries at all. They may be gradients, shifting zones, permeable doorways where two worlds intermingle without either one fully noticing. And if any consciousness continues after the body falls silent, then surely that consciousness must inhabit some kind of environment, even if it is not a place in the physical sense. A mind cannot exist in blankness. It shapes and is shaped by a context. So what is the context of the dead? Is it a dimension carved out of memory? A landscape built from impressions left behind? A realm where time is less like a line and more like an ocean one can dive into at any depth? Suppose the dead do not stand still. Suppose they move, explore, react, just as we do, only in a medium we cannot touch. Imagine a consciousness freshly separated from the body. The moment the sensory machinery that once filtered reality collapses, they might find themselves in a place without orientation, where time has loosened its grip and the anchors of identity float freely. It's possible the first thing they perceive is not a tunnel, not a light, but simple, encompassing clarity, the unfiltered sum of every moment they have experienced. Not a life review as a slideshow, but a simultaneous immersion in every instance of their existence. We struggle to imagine this because our brains enforce a strict procession of moments. But a mind freed from that machinery might feel the past as vividly as we feel the present. In this sense, the dead may not travel forward or backward. They may inhabit all their moments at once. If that is true, then interactions between the living and the dead could happen without us ever realizing. Picture a memory that surfaces suddenly, without any trigger. You feel it as a mental replay. But perhaps, for someone who has moved beyond the body, that memory is not a replay. It is a location, a place one can actually stand. Your recollection might be the faint echo of another mind brushing past that same moment from their side of existence. In other words, they are not entering your world. They are walking through their own version of a moment that you once lived, and your awareness briefly resonates with theirs. Consider how people often report sensing a presence during moments that have strong emotional weight: grief, joy, fear, deep calm. These experiences are usually dismissed as psychological, and sometimes they are. But heavy moments are also the most anchored in our memories. If those memories form part of a navigable landscape for someone beyond time, then they might naturally drift toward the moments that shine the brightest, either because they are revisiting their own or because they are brushing past the emotional imprints left behind. We may feel that brush as a presence, a chill, a sudden thought, a sense that someone is near. There is also the strange consistency in reports from near-death experiences, traditions, and spontaneous encounters. A sense of observers who do not intervene, who move with an intention that is calm, curious, or simply watchful. If the dead perceive time differently, if every moment is accessible, they might visit not to spy or to guide, but because certain moments remain meaningful to them, the way a childhood home can draw the living back decades later. They may walk through scenes not as ghosts bound to one location, but as travellers wandering through the memories of life itself. And this brings us to a more startling possibility. The boundaries between a person and their memories may be thinner after death than they ever were in life. While alive, memories degrade, distort, and scatter. But a mind unbound from the physical brain might retain them with perfect clarity. Those memories become environments. The people in them become vivid forms, not because they are actual spirits, but because the memory itself is complete. Walking through one's own past could feel as tangible as walking through a physical landscape. And if these memory places exist, the living may occasionally step into resonance with them without knowing. A déjà vu moment could be two timelines brushing against each other, your present and someone else's preserved past. The implication is dramatic. Maybe the dead don't walk through our present. They walk through something parallel, something familiar to them but uncanny to us. They may cross our lives the way hikers cross invisible property lines, unaware that they are passing close to another world. To them, the past is not behind, it is next door. But memory isn't the only potential geography of the dead. Another possibility emerges from experiences reported across cultures, zones of transition where consciousness still carries echoes of the physical world, but begins to experience something wholly new. These zones are often described as dreamlike, not because they lack structure, but because their structure is symbolic, responsive, fluid. In dreams, events follow emotional logic instead of physical rules. If a post-physical consciousness exists, it may move through something similar, a reality shaped by intention, by meaning, by unfinished threads of identity. In such a realm, movement is not bound to clock time, but to attention. If you think of someone, you are there with them, or at least with the version of them stored in your own consciousness. If you recall a moment, you inhabit it again. If you feel longing, you drift toward the source. Movement becomes a matter of focus, not distance. And if attention can bridge moments, then someone who has died could pass near the living not because they are in our present, but because attention naturally gravitates toward unresolved stories, deep bonds, or powerful memories. This could explain why people often feel the presence of loved ones shortly after they pass. The newly dead might not yet understand the new form their reality has taken. They may not even realize they have left the physical world. They might simply be following habits of thought, reaching for familiar people, familiar places, familiar emotions. These shifts of attention could manifest to the living as gentle presences, subtle signs, or even fleeting dreams that feel more like visitations than imagination. But as time progresses and the consciousness learns to navigate this new reality, the living may fade from focus. Not forgotten, but contextualized. Just as the living rarely revisit every memory, the dead might eventually move into realms that no longer overlap with our world. They may explore dimensions shaped by possibilities we cannot conceive, spaces made of intention, connection, or transformation. At that point, the living may only feel them in rare, meaningful flashes, milestones, crises, profound quiet. All of this raises a deeper question. If the dead can inhabit the past in a real way, does the past truly end? What if the flow of time is something only biological organisms experience? Imagine each moment as a page, and we flip through them one by one. The dead, no longer bound by the body's page-turning mechanism, may be able to spread the entire book open at once. They can step onto any page without altering the book itself. Our lives, from their perspective, are not sequences, but complete structures. And the present moment we inhabit is not the tip of time's arrow. It is just one accessible room in a vast architecture. If this is true, then the dead are not behind us, nor ahead, nor right beside us. They are embedded within the larger structure of time, and their movement may follow rules unlike anything we know. They might drift into moments that matter to them the way the living drift into old photographs, mementos, or memories that feel alive. They might stand in the middle of their childhood bedroom, while the living version of that room has long since changed, because their access is to the essence of the place, not its current condition. This perspective also reframes hauntings. Instead of souls trapped in a location, what if hauntings are simply echoes of someone revisiting a deeply charged memory from their own history? A person who experienced something intense in a place may walk that memory from their side, and those still alive might sense it faintly as an intrusion, a ripple, a presence. Not because the dead linger here in the physical sense, but because the emotional imprint of the moment is vivid enough to make the boundary thin. And yet, as compelling as memory realms and symbolic landscapes are, they do not fully explain the reports of the dead observing events happening now. Countless accounts describe experiences suggesting the dead respond not just to remembered moments, but to current ones. A widow sensing a spouse's presence during a major life change. A family feeling a loved one nearby during an emergency. Children speaking of deceased relatives as if they can see them watching something unfolding in real time. Are these coincidences, wishful interpretations, psychological projections? Certainly, sometimes they are. But the consistency of these reports across cultures hints at something more. The possibility that the dead can access the unfolding present, but not in the way we do. To them, the present may not be a point in time, but a vibration in the structure of all moments. Emotion, intention, threshold events. These might act like beacons. When a life shifts course dramatically, or when grief opens a raw channel, the moment becomes loud in the architecture of time. Someone beyond the body might notice this resonance and be drawn toward it, not because they are watching our world moment by moment, but because the emotional frequency aligns with something significant to them. In this view, presence is not surveillance, it is resonance. A death could create a link between two minds that last beyond the biological separation. Strong connections might act as portals across dimensions of consciousness. When one mind experiences something intense, the echo may travel through the link, drawing the other mind's attention. This could explain why many people feel visited during major milestones, emotional breakdowns, or moments of peaceful reflection. It isn't that the dead roam our current world constantly. It's that they sense when the emotional shape of a moment becomes significant enough to cross boundaries. And this leads to a final possibility. Perhaps the dead do not walk through any specific kind of time. Instead, they inhabit a state where all timelines overlap. They walk through meaning, through memory, through connection. What we call past and present might look to them like different textures of the same fabric. When they appear in our lives, or when we sense them, it might not be because they have travelled anywhere. It might be because, for a brief moment, two layers of reality align, and both sides feel the other like a shift in the air. The question that now hovers like a lantern in a corridor is this: if those who have left their bodies can step out of our timeline, what does that mean for the stories we think we're living? And what does it mean for the boundaries we assume are fixed, before, now, after? When consciousness might be wandering in places our clocks can't map. To keep moving, we have to treat time less like a ruler and more like a terrain, something with folds and cliffs and strange plateaus. In this model, the dead are not drifting through history like tourists. They're navigating through layers that intersect with ours in ways that can be subtle or startling. and this may explain why reports of encounters often carry that hard-to-describe sensation of two worlds brushing together, similar in shape but made of different fabric. One of the most intriguing ideas in physics, something that philosophers also circle around, is that events don't always sit in neat, causal rows. If consciousness is not bound by the same dependencies as physical matter, then a person who dies might wake up into a vantage point where past and present look like adjoining fields. That would allow them to revisit moments without altering them, the way you can stand at the edge of your old schoolyard without kicking over a single memory. They could observe the tiny choices that once shaped their path, the ones that seemed random at the time, but now reveal a kind of quiet architecture that isn't nostalgia, it's orientation, like learning the layout of a city after the traffic clears. Some people report sensing a presence long after a loved one has died, but what if the presence isn't moving toward them at all? What if they're simply drifting across the boundary where the person's attention is touching a moment that once mattered? Think of a musician running their fingers over the grooves of a record they once made, not to change the song, but to feel where it came from. Consciousness might do something similar, and if so, the haunting might not be the dead knocking on the door. It might be us brushing against an echo of where their attention rests. Two timelines grazing each other like reeds. Of course, this brings up the question, why would consciousness revisit anything after death? You'd think the universe would open like a vast skylight, full of wonder far more dazzling than old kitchens, old roads, old griefs. But maybe the universe is both, the wide open skylight and the old hometown. Maybe once consciousness is unbound, it can hold more than one scale at once. It can look at the cosmic vista and the tiny human detail, not because it's stuck, but because the two complement each other. A mountain climber can stand at the summit while remembering the weight of the first stone they kicked as a child. The perspective doesn't cancel itself, it layers. There's a theory woven through certain mystical traditions that suggests the dead often revisit their lives not to relive them, but to perceive them with a level of clarity that wasn't possible during the rush of being human. We make decisions inside the storm. The dead can look back at the storm from above, seeing its currents and spirals. They may walk through the moments where they hurt others, not as punishment, but as insight. They may walk through the moments where they were loved, not as sentiment, but as recognition of how connection shapes a life's architecture. If our memories are rooms, the dead are moving through them with all the lights on. But then there's the other possibility, one that feels more like stepping through a curtain than flipping through an album. Maybe death opens into a plane that doesn't sit behind or ahead of our timeline, but beside it, like a country separated by a thin, shimmering border. In this model, the dead are not dwelling in our past or our present. They are dwelling in their own present, which occasionally overlaps with ours. That overlap might feel like intuition, or déjà vu, or the sudden, inexplicable sense of being watched with kindness. This parallel terrain idea shows up in accounts from various cultures. Ancestors who remain close, not haunting, but tending, like gardeners who still water the roots even after the garden has changed hands. They're not trapped here, they're simply near. Their reality interlaces with ours at odd angles. Not all the time, but at intervals. And those intervals might be what people describe as sensing a whisper at the edge of awareness or feeling a sudden calm in the exact moment they're about to break. It's not a message in the ordinary sense. It's more like a breeze from the neighbouring country. If this is true, then the dead don't necessarily track us the way humans watch humans. They don't follow our calendars or count our milestones. Their attention moves differently, less like a line, more like a sphere. They may perceive our lives as clusters of meaning rather than sequences of events. To them, your first heartbreak and your current confusion might sit beside each other the way two stars sit in the same constellation, closer in emotional space than in chronological space. That means their presence may be felt when your inner world resembles something from your past. Not because they're watching your daily routine, but because the emotional resonance aligns like a tuning fork. This also explains why encounters with the dead often seem to happen at thresholds. Births, deaths, illnesses, recoveries, endings, beginnings. Thresholds create distortions in the usual flow of attention. They thrum with meaning. They thin the walls. If someone's consciousness on the other side is attuned to those shifts, they may drift closer, not to intervene, but because the resonance calls them. It's like a lighthouse beam sweeping across two shorelines at the same moment, illuminating each coast without needing to travel between them. Another idea, one less discussed but strangely elegant, is that consciousness after death might not be singular. A person could fragment like light through a prism, not losing themselves but branching into different levels of perception. One aspect might revisit the life to understand it. Another might move forward into a new realm of growth. Another might explore the larger structure of existence. And these aspects aren't separate people, they're layers of the same being, unfolding simultaneously. If this is true, then when the living sense the departed, they may be brushing against the layer still connected to the story of Earth. In this model, the dead don't just walk through time, they distribute themselves through meaning. You might be remembered by someone who has passed, not as a single memory, but as a cluster of emotional signatures they once shared with you. When people report dreams where the dead appear calm, composed, almost luminous, it might be because the layer of consciousness that interacts with us is the one that has already processed the tangled knots of life. What remains is clarity, curiosity, and a kind of gentle perspective that doesn't fit easily into human language. Let's return to the idea of the dead walking through the past. It's possible that what looks like a journey through old memories is not actually backward movement. It might be a movement inward, to the core threads that define a life. We think of the past as a trail behind us, but to consciousness, it might be a set of depths. Imagine a tapestry viewed from the human side. Messy knots, dangling threads, textures you pass over without noticing. But from the other side, from the side the dead might see, the design is smooth, patterned, whole. If they walk through anything, they walk through the design, not the mess. Some people fear the idea of the dead being able to witness the private moments of living people, as though death grants some kind of surveillance ability. But if consciousness becomes expansive rather than nosy, they wouldn't be fixated on our mundane details. They're not monitoring breakfast choices or arguments about laundry. If anything, they would be tuned to emotional gravity rather than behavior. They'd sense the moments when someone they once loved is unraveling, or blooming, or carrying a weight too heavy. Those are the moments that generate resonance, and resonance is what bridges worlds. There's also a stranger possibility, one that physics quietly entertains. If reality branches with every decision, then every life becomes a kind of tree with countless limbs. When consciousness leaves the body, it might no longer be restricted to one branch. It might be able to explore the different ways a life could have unfolded, not to change anything, but to understand. This could explain why near-death experiences often describe life reviews that feel non-linear, encompassing not just what happened, but what nearly happened. The dead could be exploring the architecture of choice itself. In this branching view model, the dead wouldn't be walking through the past, because the past has many versions. They'd be walking through possibility, the way a traveller might wander through an orchard, touching leaves on different branches. They might visit the version of you who chose the riskier path, or the safer path, not to judge, but to appreciate the spectrum of who you are. And when the living sense a presence during moments of doubt, it might be because multiple branches of their life are vibrating at once. Those overlapping vibrations could act like a beacon to consciousness that exists outside the single track of time. Then there's the concept that consciousness after death could move through narrative space rather than chronological space. Humans experience life as a sequence, but beneath that sequence lies story, motifs, patterns, arcs. These are the threads that give meaning to events. Consciousness might flow along those threads the way a river flows along a valley. This would allow the dead to revisit the chapters of their life without needing to obey time's ordering. They could drift from childhood joy to adult regret as easily as we drift from one memory to another in a quiet moment. This framework offers a gentle perspective on grief. If the dead walk through meaning instead of minutes, they may remain connected to the parts of you that mattered most to them, not in a spooky or possessive way, but in a way that honors the emotional architecture you built together. Connections don't have to end when the body ends. They can shift into another form, like soft light passing through a window at an angle you hadn't noticed before. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes how the room feels. Yet another possibility is that the dead don't walk anywhere at all. Instead, the living drift closer to them at particular moments. When the mind is quiet, when the heart is unsettled, when the noise of daily life thins enough for other layers of reality to seep in. In this view, the dead are not travelers, we are. We move through states that occasionally align with their presence, like two train cars passing each other silently in the fog. The encounter doesn't require effort from them, it requires stillness from us. And if consciousness after death exists in a state beyond polarity, beyond fear and desire, beyond striving and resistance, then the way they perceive us is without judgment. They don't think in terms of success or failure. They perceive growth, imbalance, potential, and resonance. They see the emotional shape of our choices rather than the choices themselves. And if they ever drift close, it might be because something in our inner pattern harmonizes with their own ongoing transformation. One more idea deserves a place on the table. Some traditions suggest that after death, consciousness may temporarily revisit moments not for closure but for release. These moments act like anchor points, places where emotional energy gathered and stayed. By walking through them, the consciousness disentangles itself, like gently removing roots from old soil. This isn't suffering, it's completion. And when those knots loosen, the echoes felt by the living often fade, not because the dead have gone far away, but because the connection has softened into peace. All these possibilities share a common thread. The dead are not bound to the tidy, linear map we use for navigating our days. They might move through layers of time or fields of meaning or branching timelines or emotional constellations. They might drift near us when resonance calls or remain in parallel terrains where our worlds touch at odd and beautiful angles. And through all of this, the living continue their own wanderings, sometimes brushing against those who have moved on, sometimes unaware of how close the borders truly are. To understand how the dead might move, or appear to move, through layers of time, we have to consider what actually binds a moment together. Humans experience time like beads on a string, but that might be a trick of the nervous system rather than a law of reality. If consciousness after death is no longer tethered to that arrangement, then the way the dead navigate their existence could resemble something closer to drifting through a gallery of meanings rather than marching across a timeline. This shift reframes everything. What we think of as the past may not be a place they revisit, but a pattern they can step into like a room built from memory and significance. Consider this. In life, we often find ourselves returning emotionally to certain events without physically going anywhere. We re-enter old heartbreaks, triumphs, arguments, revelations. We can feel them as vividly as if we were there again. If the living can do this while confined to a linear timeline, imagine how much more freely the dead might move through such territory once they've slipped the anchor of the body. This isn't reliving, it's perceiving. The difference is subtle but immense. Reliving implies you're stuck. Perceiving implies you're free. Now imagine that after death, a person discovers their life not as a river, but as a landscape. Peaks, valleys, intersections, recurring motifs. All coexisting, they walk not from childhood to old age, but across the terrain of their experiences, taking in the view from higher ground. When they step into a moment we label as the past, they are not time traveling. They are stepping into a valley that still belongs to them. And when that valley resonates strongly enough, the living who were connected to them might sense something, like a pressure shift in the atmosphere of the soul. Many people encounter this sensation in dreams. A departed parent or friend appears, not in a chaotic jumble like most dreams, but with startling clarity and coherence. Their presence feels organized, intentional. They aren't blurred by the dream logic. They stand out like a figure illuminated by a lantern behind the eyelids. What if these dream visitations are not the dead entering our thoughts, but our dreams brushing against the spaces they inhabit? Dreams loosen the grid of reality just enough for the edges of their terrain and ours to overlap. The dead don't push their way in. We drift close enough to touch their world. When a dream encounter with the dead feels calm or wise, it might be because we are glimpsing the part of their consciousness that is processing life from outside its constraints. Their perspective isn't distorted by urgency. They aren't scrambling for the right words or struggling with emotional baggage. They are speaking from the level where themes make more sense than details. And that is why what they say often feels simple but profound, almost too obvious once you hear it. What about moments of waking life perception? Those uncanny sensations of someone standing just behind you, or the sudden warmth that feels like a familiar presence. Some people try to reduce those experiences to memory artifacts or psychological projections. And yes, sometimes they absolutely are. But what if the psychological and the metaphysical are not enemies? What if the human mind is what bends first when two layers of reality get close enough to shimmer against each other? The mind might translate the contact into sensation, memory, warmth, or imagery, the same way it interprets invisible sound waves as music. If consciousness after death exists in a state where attention is fluid, they could focus on multiple locations simultaneously. Though location becomes a metaphor, not a measurement. They might be aware of someone they loved not in a surveillance sense, but as a kind of ongoing resonance. Think of two tuning forks. Strike one, and the other may hum in response if they share the right pitch. Someone who loved you deeply may have created a resonance that persists. When your inner world vibrates at a frequency that aligns with the emotional dynamic you shared, the boundary between your awareness and theirs briefly thins. This could explain why certain dates, places, or emotional states seem to trigger sensations of presence more than others. It's not the date on the calendar that matters, it's the meaning. If a particular anniversary carries emotional charge for you, that charge might strengthen the resonance. The dead aren't checking dates, they're perceiving emotion like weather. When the emotional pressure rises, they feel it. They may drift closer through the resonance, not to interfere, but because closeness becomes natural. Another idea that fits within this framework is the concept of reflective presence. When someone dies, the imprint of their consciousness might remain in the emotional structures they shaped. This isn't a ghost in the old-fashioned horror sense. It's more like a pattern of influence that retains a faint awareness. Think of it as the after-image of a person's inner life lingering in the field of reality. Not a duplicate, not an echo, but a continuation of their emotional geometry. This geometry can respond or shimmer when activated by the living who are part of its formation. This theory becomes especially interesting when applied to places. Certain locations feel charged, haunted, or vividly alive with emotional residue. Houses where generations lived, rooms where decisive moments occurred, staircases where arguments echoed, not because the dead are trapped there, but because the emotional geometry there is dense. When a consciousness steps out of the body, it might sense those dense areas the way a magnet senses fields. Some might drift through those places not because they're stuck, but because the place holds a chapter of their story they can now read clearly. But not all encounters originate with the dead. Some originate with the living pulling them closer, intentionally or not. Grief, especially deep grief, acts like a gravitational well. It bends attention. It concentrates emotion into something potent. When someone grieves intensely, they may be calling forth the resonance of a departed loved one, drawing that layer of consciousness into alignment with their own. This doesn't mean the dead are summoned like characters in a séance. It means that the emotional doorway between realms expands under pressure, and the living may interpret that expansion as presence. One of the most compelling perspectives comes from traditions that describe the afterlife as a realm of learning. Not punishment, not reward, learning. The dead move through the story of their life with new understanding, seeing their choices from angles they never had access to while alive. They see how one word spoken sharply rippled into someone's future. They see how one kindness changed the trajectory of a heart. They see the web of interactions like a massive interconnected sculpture, one they helped construct without ever seeing the full shape. As they walk through these emotional structures, their attention may pass through moments that involve the living. If you are part of a moment deeply tied to the structure they are studying or releasing, you might feel a sudden shift, an inexplicable calm, a memory surfacing out of nowhere, a sense of being held. Not because they're hovering around you constantly, but because your life intersects a beam of their attention. This framework helps answer a thorny question: do the dead worry about us? Not in the way the living worry. Their view is wider, calmer. They see our struggles not as catastrophes, but as arcs we are still drawing. If they drift close, it's not out of fear for us. It's out of resonance with something meaningful we're experiencing. They commune with meaning, not minutiae. Let's step deeper into the idea of where they might exist. If consciousness moves into a higher dimensional plane, one with more degrees of freedom, then time might be one of many coordinates. They could navigate through memory, connection, insight, possibility, and emotion the way we navigate through physical space. They could stand at the point where your future sorrow intersects with past joy, not because they are foreseeing events, but because those emotional states radiate patterns they can perceive outside linear time. Their world might be woven from the internal weather of all the lives they touched and the lessons their own life carved into them. In this multidimensional model, the dead might tune into us the way one listens through a forest. Not to specific footsteps, but to changes in the wind. They sense shifts in your inner climate. When you're lost, they may feel the turbulence. When you find clarity, they may feel the calm. But their perception isn't constant. It moves in waves, in pulses. Not always, not never, sometimes. There's another possibility. The dead may inhabit what could be called a perspectival field, a place where they can experience multiple viewpoints of the same event. They can see the version of the moment from inside their own emotions back then, and from the outside as they understand it now. They can see how others experienced it. They can see the ripple effects branching outward across years. If they focus on a moment that involved you, you might sense something. The brief brush of awareness that feels foreign, but gentle. Not an observation, but a shared point in the web lighting up again. If consciousness after death becomes capable of perceiving potential as clearly as actuality, then they may not distinguish between what happened and what could have happened in the rigid way humans do. When they walk through the past, they may also be touching the ghost versions of choices left unchosen. You may feel this as a sudden wave of insight, a strange knowing about a decision you once made, as if a voice, silent but vivid, is whispering, "Here was another path," not guiding you, just showing you the architecture. All of this points to an elegant possibility. The dead inhabit a domain where understanding unfolds in all directions. They are not stuck in old scenes like figures in frozen dioramas. They move through meaning, resonance, connection, and possibility, and we sometimes cross into the penumbra of their attention. They do not walk through your living room at 3 a.m. to check on you. They move through the emotional shape of your relationship with them. And if that shape lights up with intensity, you might feel them like a change in light at the edge of the mind. Finally, we should consider that the dead may evolve. Their consciousness may continue to grow, refine, expand. They might move farther into realms where human life becomes one of many stories they carry. When that happens, the frequency of contact with the living may lessen, not from indifference, but from transformation. A butterfly doesn't abandon the leaf it once clung to. It simply becomes attuned to different winds. But the resonance remains, like threads that never truly snap, only loosen. If all of this is true, if consciousness after death moves through meaning rather than hours, through resonance rather than footsteps, through perspectives rather than places, then the final question becomes, what does that say about us, the living? Our world is carved by clocks and calendars, but beneath those conventions runs something far older and more intricate, the architecture of awareness. That architecture might be the one shared territory between the living and the dead, the place where both sides of existence can brush against each other, even if briefly, even if wordlessly. To understand where the dead might truly walk, we have to understand what a moment actually is. Not the tick of a second, but the convergence of attention, emotion, memory, and meaning. A moment becomes real when consciousness invests itself in it. If consciousness is what survives death, then the dead move through moments not as points in time, but as nodes of significance, intersections where their story touches others. This changes the idea of the past. The past is not behind them. It's simply a cluster of nodes, some bright, some dim, some still pulsing with unfinished or deeply cherished meaning. From this viewpoint, the dead don't revisit every moment equally. They return, or perhaps drift, toward the ones that were formative. Moments of love, regret, revelation, kindness withheld or offered, choices taken or avoided. These moments are dense with meaning. They stand out in the field of their life the way tall mountains stand out on a horizon. And because these peaks are connected to other people, the living may feel a subtle shift when the dead move through those landscapes. Not a haunting, more like an echo in the field of the heart. Children sometimes report seeing or speaking to deceased relatives with a casual ease that adults find uncanny. But perhaps it isn't uncanny at all. Children experience the world with fewer conceptual walls. Their attention is soft and permeable. They don't cling as tightly to the idea that only the material is real. If the dead inhabit a domain where meaning shines brighter than form, then they might be more easily perceived by those who haven't yet learned to narrow their awareness. A child may drift close to that border without even trying, opening a brief window that later becomes a half-remembered story. Adults, weighed down by structure, may still encounter these moments, but often in times when structure collapses. Grief, shock, illness, awe, intense creativity, profound exhaustion, deep meditation. These states soften the walls. They tilt the mind into a more fluid mode, like water spreading over the floor of the psyche. In those softened states, the frequency of the living might overlap with the frequency of the dead. The encounter may be fleeting, a sensation, an impression, but it feels meaningful because both sides temporarily inhabit the same kind of awareness. One theory suggests that after death, consciousness may move through a process similar to what we experience in dreams, except far more coherent and expansive. Dreams compress symbolic meaning into imagery and sensation. They distill emotion into narrative. If the dead navigate a realm where symbolic resonance is the primary structure, then they might perceive the story of their life as a kind of living tapestry. They can walk across it, explore it, examine the relationships and inflection points not through memory alone, but through immersion. They might see the symbolism of their life the way an artist sees the symbolism of their own work, patterns emerging only when viewed from a distance. This would mean that the dead are not bound by nostalgia. They are bound by understanding. What they revisit to comprehend, to integrate, to grow. And understanding, once gained, radiates outward. It affects the living indirectly, like the way sunlight reflected off water can dance across a wall. Many people report feeling sudden clarity or internal peace after long periods of grief, as if something resolved beyond their awareness. It may be that the dead, completing their own integration, alter the emotional resonance of the connection, and the living feel that shift like a gentle release. Another possibility is that consciousness after death can inhabit something akin to narrative space, a dimension made of stories, where events aren't arranged chronologically but thematically. In narrative space, similar moments attract each other. Lessons cluster. Roles echo. The dead might perceive all the moments when they acted from fear clustered together like a constellation. All the moments where they acted from kindness arranged like a river. They may navigate these constellations the way we navigate ideas, jumping from one to another through meaning rather than movement. And if narrative space is real, the living might tune into it through intuition. Sometimes you feel the shape of your life shifting, as if an invisible storyline is nudging you toward transformation. Sometimes you sense guidance, not in words, but in a pattern. The same theme returning, the same emotional beat repeating until you're ready to understand it. It's possible that the dead, perceiving the large-scale architecture of story, can influence these patterns very gently. More suggestion than intervention, more gravity than force. If consciousness after death continues to learn, then the dead don't become omniscient beings. They become expanding ones. They might be able to perceive truth with far greater clarity than we can, but they're still moving through levels of understanding. They're still growing, and growth implies direction. If there is a trajectory to their journey, it may move toward integration, integrating their life story, their relationships, their impact, their unexpressed potentials. This trajectory might gradually shift them into realms where human timelines feel distant and small. And yet, the connections they formed in life remain part of their architecture, like threads woven into a larger tapestry. This may be why encounters with the dead often feel like blessings rather than conversations. The dead don't speak in long explanations. They make contact through presence, through clarity, through peace. They offer the emotional equivalent of a lantern rather than a map. This is consistent with the idea that their attention is diffuse, not pinpointed, compassionate, not controlling. They don't hover over the living with concern about daily actions. They perceive the direction of someone's inner growth, and they may amplify clarity if the resonance allows. What about the fear, the darker reports, the stories of unsettling encounters? If consciousness after death carries unfinished emotional residue, then some layers of the deceased might linger in patterns that feel heavy, confused, or unresolved. But this isn't the caricature of restless spirits pacing hallways. It's more akin to a knot in the emotional field. When the living encounter such energy, it may feel uncomfortable because it resonates with something unhealed in themselves. The dead are not attacking, they're simply still processing, still evolving. And the living, brushing against that knot, feel its tension. In rare cases, living people report encounters that feel extraordinarily vivid, as if someone who has died is fully present for a brief moment. These experiences often occur during transitions, births, deaths, major breakthroughs, catastrophic breakdowns. Those thresholds might generate such intense meaning that the layers of reality interlace more tightly than usual. For one moment, the dead may perceive the living with unusual clarity, and the living may perceive the dead with unusual sensitivity. Such moments are often described as sacred, not frightening, even when they defy explanation. What then is the most accurate way to imagine where the dead walk? Perhaps the answer is that they walk through the territory of consciousness itself. The living occupy one region of that territory, bounded by time and body. The dead occupy a neighbouring region, bounded by neither. The border between these regions isn't a wall, it's a gradient, sometimes steep, sometimes subtle. And at certain states of mind, the gradient becomes thin enough that awareness can shimmer across it. This explains the paradox at the heart of the whole question. The dead feel far away and strangely near at the same time. Far because their perspective has expanded beyond the narrow corridor we walk. Near because meaning and connection don't dissolve with the body, they deepen. When people say the dead are always with us, perhaps it's not a sentimental phrase, but a literal one, just not in the physical sense. The dead remain connected through the emotional geometry they helped shape. They remain connected through resonance, through meaning, through the structure of the relationships that wove your lives together. The connection doesn't disappear. it simply changes its physics. This leads to a gentler, more compassionate understanding of existence as a whole. Instead of imagining life and death as two domains separated by a locked gate, picture them as two wings of the same vast house, different rooms, different atmosphere, but under one roof of consciousness. Doors between the rooms open at odd times. Light spills across the threshold unexpectedly. Footsteps echo from one wing to the other in ways you can't always track. The inhabitants of each wing carry on, sometimes aware of each other, sometimes not, but always part of the same structure. The living are still responsible for shaping their stories. The dead are responsible for understanding theirs. Both are participating in a larger pattern, something woven from the evolution of consciousness across countless lifetimes, relationships, failures, triumphs, and revelations. The dead aren't watching every move you make, but they remain attuned to the currents that truly matter. Your growth, your sorrow, your awakening, your resilience. And when your own life reaches its threshold, when you step across whatever border awaits, you might find yourself not entering a new place, but expanding into a larger version of the place you've always been. The people you've lost might meet you not from some distant heaven or forgotten realm, but from the next room over. You might recognize the terrain not as a foreign land, but as the inner landscape of meaning you've been shaping all along. In that sense, the dead don't walk through the past or the present. They walk through the architecture of consciousness, and we walk through a dense, slower region of that same architecture. The two realms differ in texture, not in essence, and the contact between them, those moments of presence, intuition, dream, or sudden clarity, is not an intrusion. It's the natural result of living in a reality far more interconnected than it appears. So the dead are not gone. They have moved into a wider room of the same house, where time folds like fabric and meaning becomes the map. And sometimes, when the conditions align, we feel the faint warmth of their presence passing through the walls. Not lost, not watching, but continuing their journey in a realm where understanding itself is the ground they walk on.